CBS News senior foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab has more from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, on the prospects of a new U.S.-Iran deal.
Well, President Trump really surprising everyone here in Islamabad after he said that talks could come in the next day or two. Surprising because the Pakistani Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, isn't even in the country. He's actually in Saudi Arabia right now as part of this whistle-stop tour, which will see him also go to Qatar and to Turkey. And it really seems that from the Pakistani point of view is that they're trying to build a coalition of allies of the U.S. and indeed countries who can talk to Iran to try to get these two sides together and try to negotiate a deal which will not only end the war, but solve many of the really deep-seated issues that divide the U.S. and Iran. That, of course, is Iran's nuclear program, but also the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway in which 20% of the world's energy passes through. That, of course, has become this major sticking point ever since Iran put out its own blockade. Of course, the U.S. has its own blockade. And so really what we're seeing here is this huge push to try to get these two sides back together again. President Trump signaling that Islamabad, where we are now, is his preferred destination, with the Pakistani leadership here no longer calling it the Islamabad talks, but the Islamabad process, saying this is such a complex issue. The divisions between Washington and Tehran are so wide that it's going to take more than one meeting. Still, that meeting that we saw on Saturday, that 21-hour marathon session in which such a high-level Iranian delegation and such a high-level American delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, that was nothing short of historic. It does seem that a lot was achieved, just not enough to get that deal. And the Pakistani leadership are hoping that they can get these two sides back to the table again and really find a way forward to not only end the war, but hopefully find a path forward for the U.S. and Iran, which have been bitter rivals for nearly half a century. Back to you.
All right, Imtiaz, thank you very much. For more on this, I want to bring in former National Security Advisor to President Trump and the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, always good to have you, sir. Thank you.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so it's no secret that you have long been a hawk on Iran, but I'm curious, sir, about this strategy that this White House has employed in this what many are calling a war. Clearly, Iran has been decimated militarily. Their navy doesn't exist anymore. Their ballistic missile capabilities have been destroyed. Their ability to project power beyond their borders has been practically eradicated. But I wonder, sir, if you were still in your position in the White House, is this how you would have advised the president to conduct this operation, given that, as you know, it's not just, you don't win a war just through military force or just by bombing your enemy or your adversary into submission. There are other factors that need to be taken into account. And it doesn't seem, at least at this point, that the White House perhaps thought this through to the point where we are today. How would you have advised the president differently from what he's been advised to this time or at this juncture?
Well, the first thing is to find out what his objective is. And to this day, I can't say that I fully understand what his objective is. I come from the perspective of wishing that we could see regime change in Iran, because after 47 years of trying to change this ideology's behavior, we've seen that it's not going to change their behavior. So unless you want to live under the threats that it poses, the nuclear threat, the terrorist threat, the threat to the global economy we see playing out now in the Strait of Hormuz, unless you want to live with those, if you can't change a regime's behavior, the only alternative is change the regime. I don't know that's what Trump was up to. He's certainly not done things that are necessary if that was his objective. Most importantly, as far as anyone can see, he has not consulted with or aided the opponents of the regime inside Iran, who could be working right now to open up splits within what's left of the top leadership of the regime and cause it to collapse internally. There's very widespread opposition to the regime. I think it's at its weakest point since it took power in 1979. But the opposition doesn't have many guns, doesn't have great organization. It could use a lot of help, not any of which I think we've been providing.
So, Ambassador, it strikes me, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Does it strike you that for perhaps that emboldened by our military success in Venezuela, that the president and his advisors thought simply decapitating the Iranian leadership by taking out Ayatollah Khamenei and other top senior officials in Iran would be enough to bring about regime change. The president keeps saying that there has been regime change, but you and I know regime change is not just necessarily one figure. Do you think that they perhaps believed this notion that the people would rise up once the United States took out Khamenei and that would lead to the change that you're talking about? Or, because I'm just trying to understand, just taking out somebody doesn't mean you're necessarily changing the regime.
No, 100% true. And in fact, we've taken out more than one person. We've taken out 400 or 500 by conservative estimates. I don't think it's a question of the people rising up and going out into the streets. They were demonstrating against the wretched state of the Iranian economy back in December and January. And for their troubles, the regime killed upwards of 40,000 of them, just massacred them, machine gunned them in the streets. So there's no point really in saying to the opposition, go ahead, go out and do it again, and expecting anything different until a lot of work behind the scenes has been done to find figures within the regime, maybe the regular army, not the Revolutionary Guard, but the regular army who are prepared to defect to the opposition when the time comes. This is all work that's not going to be seen publicly for sure, but that's how you lay the precondition to take advantage of the internal fractures in the regime that I think the attack has already caused. And it is possible that Trump thought it would be easy, like capturing Maduro was. But I know for a fact that since we talked about a lot of these issues in the first term, when I tried to persuade him to adopt regime change and obviously failed, he knows about, he's been told about the risks of the Strait of Hormuz, the risk that the Iranians would target the Gulf Arab states. And I'd be willing to bet a small fortune that the Pentagon told him about all these risks again. Now, maybe he didn't pay attention, but none of this is any surprise, I think, to any close observer of Iran.
Ambassador, you're hawkish on Iran, and you just said you tried to convince the president to pursue regime change when you were working with him in the White House. But do you think we should be in this war now?
Well, I wish about, in many respects, that it had been gone about differently. It would have been useful for the president to make what I think is a very compelling case for regime change in Iran, make that case to the American people, make it to Congress, make it to our allies, none of which he did, in addition to not coordinating with and aiding the opposition. But he's now done it. And the question is, what should we do? Should we press on for regime change or declare victory and go home? I think the logic for regime change is inescapable. I think the Gulf Arab states have no interest whatever in being left subordinates, vassals, if you will, to the regime in Tehran. And I think the Iranian people, as I say, are desperately unhappy with the regime for many, many reasons. But I don't sense the president has a plan. I think he's made clear in many, many different ways he wants out. He's looking for a way to declare victory. And I think if we leave, at least without reopening the Strait of Hormuz militarily to Gulf Arab oil, then I think it's a very hollow victory if that's what he does.
Do you think he's improvising?
I think on a daily basis. As I say, if you had looked at the past 7 weeks, and on any given day asked what our principal objectives were, you could have gotten a different answer almost every day. And that's simply not the way to engage in this kind of activity. You have to have persistence, you have to have patience, you have to have a plan, and most important of all, you have to have objectives. And that's just not the case. They say, well, our objective was to destroy the Navy, destroy the Air Force. Those are not political objectives. Those are military objectives, and apparently we've done that. But what's the geopolitical objective here? There's been no answer to that.
Ambassador, how do you think the Chinese are feeling watching all of this unfold, and perhaps even the Russians? But I wonder, given, again, you're seeing the full display of American military might, and it is awesome and breathtaking to witness. But on the other, as you just pointed out, even if the end of this conflict were to happen this week, what kind of victory would we be talking about? I mean, you and others who've been around for some time understand. Look at South Vietnam and North Vietnam. I mean, we militarily, we won that war if you just look by the numbers. But at the end of the day, we know that in the ways that it counts, we actually didn't win that war. And so I wonder how the Chinese are looking at how we have, how this is all played out, and what lessons are they drawing for it that they will bank in the future, for the future?
Well, I think that China should be very worried. And, one of the things that we can only speculate on is exactly how much damage has been caused inside Iran. But the level of damage, the Iranian government itself said recently, within the past day or two, would take about 12 years to recover from. Now, if you lay that on top of what was already an economy in deep, deep trouble, this indicates that the country has been harmed very, very badly. And I think that is reflected in instability in the what's left of the regime as it now stands. So I think we're actually closer to regime change than is apparent on the outside, because there aren't any Western journalists inside reporting on what's happened. They're in every capital, every major city along the Gulf and the Middle East. Every Iranian drone, every missile that we see is reported on. There's no reporting on what our strikes have done inside the country. So I think China probably knows what the impact of all that is. They've seen how we can operate at great distances from America. They ought to be very worried.
Quickly, though, sir. So, again, going back to the question of whether, if this conflict were to end right now, and let's say the president does get some of the concessions that he's looking for, there are reports that perhaps the Iranians would not be allowed to enrich uranium for a period of time, maybe 5 years. The president, I think, wants 10 years or forever. But let's say they come to some sort of an agreement. What happens next within Iran? Do they rebuild whatever it is that we've destroyed? And I don't mean from a military standpoint, but I mean the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Does the next cleric, the one perhaps we haven't heard of, does that person become the cult of personality figure? Or is there somebody that we've cultivated, us, the Israelis, who could be a leader that leads Iran to closer to regime change? I mean, I'm just trying to think, like, what would we see them become closed off and become like North Korea, just more of an enemy of ours?
Well, I think it's the ideology that we're fighting, and it's been the ideology of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 for the last 47 years. You could have Ayatollah 51 or Ayatollah 52. At this point, it really wouldn't make any difference. And they certainly would try to build everything back. We could be in a very similar situation within a finite period of time if they're allowed to sell oil on the market. And whatever concession they make, I don't trust them as far as I can throw them to live up to it. For example, even if they said no uranium enrichment for 5 years, that doesn't stop them from contracting with North Korea, with which they've had a long relationship, to say, well, why don't you enrich uranium for us under some mountain in North Korea, and we'll pay you for that. These are things that you cannot resolve in one meeting, even if it's 20 hours long, or two meetings, even if it's 20 hours long. And it's a tactic the Iranian regime has used for many years: just negotiate and negotiate, eat up time, and rebuild.
Always fascinating to have your insights, Ambassador John Bolton. Thank you very much, sir. Really, really interesting conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And a quick programming note, from gas prices to airline fees to mortgage rates, we're taking a deep dive into how the war with Iran is affecting your wallet. The Daily Report, Setting It Straight, streams tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News 24/7.